The massive oak doors of St. Mark's Cathedral swung open, slicing through the heavy, perfumed silence of the nave. At the front, near the altar, Mayor Douglas Vance stopped mid-sentence. His eulogy for the wife he had spent 40 years tormenting hung in the air, unfinished. I stepped across the threshold. The distinct, rhythmic clink-clink of my medals against my dress blues echoed off the vaulted stone ceiling, sharper than any church bell. Heads turned. 500 of the city's wealthiest donors, politicians and socialites twisted in their pews, a collective gasp rippling through them like a wave. Douglas froze. His hand gripped the lectern so hard his knuckles turned white. His eyes locked onto me, then darted to the sheriff standing in the shadows of the side aisle. I could see his lips move, forming the silent, frantic question. Who is that? He thought I was a crasher. He thought I was security's problem. I ignored the murmurs swelling around me. I walked straight down the center aisle, my boots striking the marble with military precision. I didn't look at the cameras flashing in the press gallery. I didn't look at the sheriff shifting his hand toward his belt. I kept my eyes fixed on the mahogany casket at the front of the room. I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to shatter an image. Before I tell you what, he whispered to the sheriff when he finally recognized my eyes. Tell me, have you ever had to become someone else just to survive your own family? Douglas met me 3 feet from the mahogany casket. To the cameras positioned in the choir loft, it looked like a grieving father reaching out to embrace a prodigal daughter. He opened his arms, his face a mask of tragic forgiveness. But I knew the man behind the mask. As he pulled me into the hug, his fingers dug into my triceps with bruising force. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear, smelling of peppermint and rot. Play along, you ungrateful brat, he hissed, his voice so low only I could hear it. Turn around, walk out the side door, and disappear. If you make a scene here, I will bury you so deep nobody will ever find you. For a split second, the 16-year-old girl who had begged him not to leave her on the side of the highway flickered in my chest. She wanted to run. She wanted to apologize. But that girl died 20 years ago in a homeless shelter. The woman standing in her place was Charlotte, 36 years old, a tactical commander who had led teams through war zones that made this cathedral look like a playground. I didn't pull away violently. I didn't scream. I simply executed a standard close-quarters disengagement. I stepped sideways, breaking his grip with a subtle twist of my shoulder, leaving him grasping at empty air. He stumbled, just barely, his composure cracking for a fraction of a second. I walked past him. I stepped up to the pulpit he had just vacated. The microphone was still warm. I adjusted it, the metal cool under my gloved fingers. The silence in the room stretched tight, a rubber band waiting to snap. My father, I said, my voice projected and steady, trained to cut through the noise of engines and gunfire, has spent 20 years telling you a story. Douglas stood frozen near the first pew, his face draining of color. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. He told you I ran away. He told you I was an addict. He told you I broke my mother's heart. I scanned the crowd, locking eyes with the church elders, the city council members, the people who had pitied Douglas for decades. But I didn't run away. I was discarded. 20 years ago, he drove me to the state line, threw a trash bag of my clothes into a ditch, and told me to never come back because I was an inconvenience to his campaign. A murmur rippled through the pews. It started low and rose quickly, a tide of shock and confusion. Douglas took a step toward me, his hand half raised, but he stopped. He knew the cameras were rolling. He was trapped in his own performance. I didn't die in that ditch, I continued. I survived. I enlisted. I served. And I built a life that has nothing to do with this town's lies. I looked down at him. He looked small. The looming giant of my childhood had shrunk into a petty, frightened old man in an expensive suit. And contrary to what he told you, I didn't come here alone. I pointed to the front row. Caleb stood up. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He stood at parade rest, 6'2" of quiet, dangerous capability, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him like armor. He locked eyes with Douglas and gave a single, slow nod. Meet my husband, I said. Caleb. Douglas looked from me to Caleb, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. He slumped slightly, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The narrative he had carefully curated for 2 decades had just been decapitated in under 2 minutes. I stepped down from the pulpit. The air felt lighter. I had said it. I had exposed him. I walked toward the casket to finally pay my respects, feeling the adrenaline recede into a calm sense of victory. I thought it was over. I thought I had won. I was naive. I should have known better. You don't defeat a man like Douglas by embarrassing him. You only make him dangerous. I turned my back on him to walk toward the casket, my hand reaching out to touch the polished wood one last time. I thought the silence in the room was the silence of respect. I thought I had won. But behind me, the sound of a single, sharp snap of fingers cut through the air like a pistol crack. The heavy side doors of the cathedral burst open. The heavy thud of tactical boots on the stone floor drowned out the organ's low hum. I turned, my hand hovering inches from my mother's flowers. Sheriff Barnes was already halfway down the aisle. He wasn't walking like a man paying his respects. He was walking like a man, executing a raid. 2 deputies flanked him, their hands resting ominously on their belts. They didn't look at Douglas. They looked straight at me. Douglas hadn't slumped in defeat. He was standing tall again, straightening his jacket, a cold, satisfied sneer curling the corner of his mouth. He hadn't been afraid of my return. He had been counting on it. "Sheriff," Douglas said, his voice projecting easily to the back pews. "Please remove this woman. She is disturbing the peace." "Charlotte Vance," the sheriff barked, stepping into my personal space, blocking my path to the exit. "You are under arrest." I didn't flinch. "On what grounds?" "Fraud," Barnes said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal caught the light, glinting silver. "Identity theft. And impersonating a military officer." The accusation hit me harder than a physical blow. "Stolen valor." He was accusing me of faking the very service that had saved my life. He was stripping away the one thing I had built that was entirely, undeniably mine. "That is a lie," I said, my voice dropping an octave, deadly calm. "And you know it." "Grab her," Douglas ordered. The deputies moved in. One grabbed my left arm, his grip unnecessarily rough, twisting my wrist behind my back. The pain was sharp, immediate. But I didn't struggle. I knew the protocol. Resisting now would only give them the footage they wanted. I looked out at the congregation. 500 people. People who had known my mother. People who had watched me grow up. I waited for someone to stand up. I waited for a single voice to cry out against this insanity. But no one moved. And in that split second, scanning their faces, the pity, the averted eyes, the self-righteous nodding, I finally understood the true depth of what Douglas had done. This was the trap I hadn't seen coming. For 20 years, while I was sleeping in barracks and leading patrols, Douglas hadn't just been erasing me. He had been rewriting me. He had spent 2 decades playing the role of the pious, heartbroken father burdening a cross no one else could see. Every Sunday, he must have stood at that pulpit and asked for prayers for his troubled daughter. He must have whispered stories at potlucks about my addiction, my mental breaks, my delusions. He had normalized the cruelty. He had twisted the narrative so thoroughly that to these people, seeing the sheriff handcuff a woman in a dress uniform didn't look like abuse. It looked like an intervention. They didn't see a commander being framed. They saw a sick, dangerous woman finally getting the help her saint of a father had been praying for. They weren't silent because they were scared. They were silent because they thought he was right. Douglas stepped closer, playing to his audience perfectly. He shook his head, looking down at me with a performance of deep, weary sadness. "I'm sorry, everyone," he said, his voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "We tried to keep this private. She's not well. She hasn't been well for a long time. This uniform, this act, it's just another episode." He looked at me, his eyes dead and hard as stones. "Get her out of here, Sheriff, before she hurts herself." The cuffs clicked shut around my wrists. The sound was final. I was trapped in the center of the sanctuary, surrounded by armed men and a town that believed I was a monster. Caleb stood a few feet away, his muscles coiled tight, ready to spring. I caught his eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. "Not yet." Douglas leaned in as the deputies began to haul me away from my mother's body. "I told you," he whispered, a smile touching his lips. "You don't have a name here unless I give you one." The steel of the handcuffs bit into my wrists, cold and unforgiving. The sensation wasn't new. I'd felt it in training exercises, in SEER school, in situations far more dangerous than a politician's funeral. But this specific coldness, the sharp, metallic pinch, didn't transport me back to boot camp. It dragged me back to a gravel shoulder on Route 9, exactly 20 years ago. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. Mile marker 114. It was raining that night, a freezing, sideways sleet that stung my face. I was 16, wearing a thin denim jacket and holding a black hefty bag that contained everything I owned. Douglas hadn't even turned off the engine. He had leaned across the passenger seat, popped the lock, and shoved me out. "You're a cancer, Charlotte," he had said, his voice flat, devoid of anything resembling fatherhood. "I'm cutting you out before you kill the host." I remembered banging on the glass as he drove away. I remembered running until my lungs burned, screaming for him to come back, believing that if I just apologized enough, if I just shrank myself small enough, he would turn around. I spent that night curled under a concrete overpass, shivering so violently I thought my teeth would shatter, waiting for a savior who never came. The sheriff yanked my arm, pulling me off balance, snapping me back to the present. I looked at Douglas. He was watching me with the same expression he'd worn that night on Route 9. Contempt mixed with relief. He wasn't just arresting me. He was finishing the job. He was driving away again, leaving me on the side of the road. Only this time the road was a federal prison cell and the trash bag was a felony record. But he made one critical miscalculation. He was looking for the 16-year-old girl who cried in the rain. He didn't realize he was staring at a woman who had spent 2 decades learning how to hunt predators in the dark. I didn't pull away from the sheriff. I didn't cry out for mercy. I let the metal dig into my skin, using the pain as a focal point. In the Navy, we call it tactical patience. You let the enemy commit. You let them extend their lines until they are so confident, so overextended, that they expose their throat. Douglas thought this was a victory lap. I saw it for what it was. A confession. By arresting me, he wasn't just silencing a daughter, he was weaponizing the law to protect a lie. And in doing so, he had just given me the moral clearance to destroy him. I locked eyes with him. I didn't blink. I let him see the shift. I let him see the moment the grief evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard math of retribution. You should have checked the rearview mirror, Dad, I thought. You should have made sure I was actually dead. I stopped resisting the deputies. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back so my ribbons caught the light. Even in handcuffs, I stood at attention. You're making a mistake, Sheriff, I said, my voice low and devoid of fear. Tell it to the judge, Barnes spat, shoving me toward the aisle. I looked past him to Caleb. He hadn't moved. His face was a mask of stone, but his hand was resting casually inside his jacket pocket. He raised one eyebrow, a silent question. Green light? I gave a microscopic nod. Burn it down. I stopped fighting the cuffs. I let my muscles go loose, not in surrender, but in a shift of stance. In close quarters combat, you don't waste energy pushing against a wall. You find the crack and you shatter it. Sheriff, I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the cathedral, to the reporters I knew were huddled near the font. I am a commissioned officer in the United States Navy. Do you have a representative from the Judge Advocate General's office present? Barnes blinked, threw off his rhythm. I don't need a JAG officer to arrest a fraud. You do if you want the charges to stick, I replied, my tone clinical, bored. Otherwise, you're just kidnapping a federal employee in front of a live press pool. I saw the cameras in the back row swivel. The red tally lights blinked on. Barnes hesitated, his eyes darting to Douglas for instruction. That was the crack. I pivoted, turning my back on the sheriff and facing my father. The handcuffs limited my movement, but they didn't limit my voice. This isn't about stolen valor, Douglas, I said. And it's not about Mom. It's about the beneficiary line on her life insurance policy. The air in the room changed instantly. The pity evaporated, replaced by the sharp, electric charge of a scandal breaking in real time. Douglas stiffened. You're delusional, he scoffed. But his eyes were tight, panicked. This is about your mental health. Is it? I pressed, stepping toward him. The deputies grabbed my arms, but I didn't stop talking. $2.5 million, Dad. That's the payout on Mom's policy. The policy she took out 20 years ago. The week after you kicked me out. The policy she kept secret from you because she knew exactly what you would do if you found it. She was sick, Douglas shouted, his composure fracturing. She didn't know what she was doing. You manipulated her. I haven't spoken to her in 20 years because you wouldn't let me, I shot back. So how did I manipulate her? Or maybe she just finally saw you for what you are. I was baiting him. I was pushing him into the open, forcing him to defend his greed instead of his grief. I needed him to claim ownership. I needed him to admit that he had the documents. You have no rights here, Douglas roared, stepping into the aisle, forgetting the cameras, forgetting the grieving widower act. That money belongs to this family. To the estate, not to some runaway who shows up looking for a handout. I don't need a handout, I said. Cold as ice. I make more in a month than you steal in a year. The crowd gasped. Douglas turned purple. You think you can come into my town, into my church, and audit me? He spat. I think you're terrified, I said. Because you know that policy names me as the sole beneficiary. And you know that if I walk out of here a free woman, you lose everything. That's why you have the sheriff here. That's why you're trying to bury me. It's not an intervention, Dad. It's a heist. I looked past him to Caleb. He was standing perfectly still, his phone held casually at his side, screen dark, but his thumb hovering over the side button. We had rehearsed this. We knew exactly where the breaking point was. Douglas looked around the room. He saw the doubt creeping into the faces of his voters. He saw the sheriff looking unsure. He realized he was losing the narrative again. He needed to end this. He needed a trump card. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "You want to talk about the policy?" he hissed, a manic glint entering his eyes. "Let's talk about the policy." My pulse spiked. Got him. Douglas didn't just pull out a piece of paper. He pulled out a weapon. It was a single sheet of heavy bond paper, creased from being folded in his pocket. But the notary seal at the bottom was unmistakable. It was the beneficiary designation form. The one document that proved my mother intended every cent of that $2.5 million to go to me, not him. "This policy?" he sneered, holding it up so the light from the stained glass windows hit the seal. "The one you claim names you? Strange. Because the copy I have says your mother signed everything over to the estate 3 days before she died." I stared at the signature at the bottom. It was shaky. Barely legible, the handwriting of a dying woman who had been coerced, medicated, or forged. It didn't matter which. In that moment, in this room, it looked official. "That's a forgery," I said, my voice tight. "Mom wouldn't have signed that." "Prove it," Douglas said. He laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed off the stone walls. "You can't. Because you're a fraud in handcuffs, and I'm the mayor. I'm the grieving widower. And this," he waved the paper in the air like a flag. "This is just a piece of paper." He reached into his pocket again. This time, he pulled out a silver lighter. The sheriff tightened his grip on my arm, anticipating my lunge. But I didn't move. I stood frozen, watching Douglas flick the wheel. The flames sprang to life, small and blue, dancing in the stagnant air of the sanctuary. The church gasped as Douglas set fire to the document, burning evidence in front of hundreds, convinced he was untouchable. Smoke curled into the air as my mother's signature vanished in flames. I struggled, shouting for the sheriff to stop him. No one moved. The deputies watched in silence as my inheritance turned to ash. Douglas crushed the remains under his shoe, smiling. He told the crowd it was meaningless, a copy, a lie, and declared there was no policy. Only a sick girl who belonged back in the hospital. He leaned in close and whispered that he had erased me once, and had done it again. The sheriff dragged me away as the room murmured. The truth seemingly gone. But Douglas was wrong about one thing. He thought that paper was my leverage. Burning it, he believed, ended me. In reality, it triggered everything. I stopped resisting. I smiled. "I was hoping you'd do that," I said calmly. "I needed you to destroy evidence in front of witnesses." Douglas scoffed until Caleb stepped forward, flashed his badge, and identified himself as a special agent with the Federal Anti-Corruption Task Force. 6 mourners rose in the pews, shedding coats to reveal FBI vests. The sheriff reached for his gun and froze. Douglas panicked, screaming entrapment. I told him I hadn't tricked him, I had simply let him be himself. Then I produced the truth. From my uniform pocket, I pulled a sealed envelope. The original insurance policy. Certified. Safe. My mother had mailed it weeks before her death, along with a journal documenting 20 years of bribes, kickbacks, and stolen public funds. She hadn't been weak. She had been patient. "She didn't leave me money," I told him. "She left me the map to bury you." Douglas collapsed as agents closed in. Caleb cuffed him for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. When Douglas begged me as his daughter, I answered simply, I didn't have a father. I had a target. They dragged him out as cameras broadcast his downfall live. In the silence that followed, I saluted my mother's casket. She had played the long game, and won. The town fell soon after. The corrupt sheriff's department was dismantled. I later bought the old station with my mother's money and turned it into a youth shelter, open doors, always lit. My father tried to erase me. Instead, he gave me the blueprint to destroy him.